Today on Pots and Trowels I'm sowing onion seed to give us an autumn crop, and that's brought to you with the support of Cobra Garden and Allett. Hello and welcome to Pots and Trowels. Well, here we are still in the middle of January, but it's time to start planning ahead to things that we want to grow in the garden through the season, whether it's flowers, fruit or vegetables. And one of the things that I always grow lots of in the veg garden is onions. We use lots of them. Jill does in lots of her delicious recipes, and very often I grow them from onion sets, and they're just a small immature onion bulb that we buy in the spring, plant them out usually March, April time, and that produces a large onion for us to lift at the end of the summer. But you can also grow onions very successfully from seed, and in my Christmas card that came from Robinson's this year, that's the nursery up in Lancashire, I got a packet of Mammoth improved onions, and these are lovely large onions. And if you want to grow the larger onions, which have got a mild flavour, you're better to start a little bit earlier, and you can start any time from December. Some of these specialist growers and the exhibition growers will have already got seedlings through, but ideally try to get them sown by mid to late February at the latest. But now is the ideal time to do it, just to give you a bit of a head start really, so that we can get some good plants to plant out in the spring. But you do need to give them some protection. We can't sow them directly into the garden at this time of the year. They need a little bit of warmth to help those seeds to germinate on. So what we need is a propagator of some form, either in a greenhouse if you've got a heated bench, or if you haven't got a greenhouse, don't worry, you can still do it by using one of these very small but inexpensive propagators. And we bought this a couple of years ago. I think it was only about 16 or 17 pounds. It's heated, so you plug it into a socket. It's got a built-in element in the base in there, and then it's got a piece of capillary matting we put on the top that we keep moist. And this one actually comes with 2 seed trays, but you can use your own pots or trays if you want. And plugged in, that will give just gentle heat. It's 5 amps, so it costs nothing to run at all. And then it has a perspex lid on there to keep that warmth in, and we put that on a bright windowsill. We can start lots of seedlings off nice and early in the season, just to give us that head start. So that's what we're going to use to get the onions to germinate. So I'm going to use one of the seed trays that's in this. We might as well, because I'm going to hopefully sow about 25-30 seeds in there to produce some seedlings. So I've got a plastic seed tray there, and then what we need of course is some compost. So this is a multi-purpose compost here. So first thing is, if it comes straight out the bag, we don't want any woody bits in there, but we want to break up any lumps of compost in there. We want to give them a really good start, and that is important when we're sowing seeds. We need seed trays that are clean, plant pots that are clean, fresh compost to give them the best possible start, and preparation is important. So I'm going to put my compost in there nice and loose like that, and then I'm just going to brush this out of the way. And then what I'm going to do is use my hand just to level it off. It really annoys me when I see people sowing seeds on rough surfaces of compost. We need to give them all the same conditions to germinate. So I'm just using my hand very carefully, picking any bits of woody compost out to give a level surface, and then I'm just going to give that a tap. Now what I like to do when I'm sowing is to just firm it very gently. This is a very spongy organic compost, but it would dry out if we don't firm it, but we don't want it too firm that it holds the water. Now you could use just a piece of wood. I mean, I've got my own homemade little presser boards that I've had for years in all different shapes and sizes for pots and seed trays, but you can also buy them. This one isn't obviously going to fit in there, it's not quite right. So I've got this one here, but it is basically just a piece of wood, and all I'm going to do is very gently firm that down. Now I'm only pushing the compost down probably 4 or 5 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch. So when I feel that, it's still springy, but it's just taken that very loose layer off, and that now gives me a really level surface to sow on, and that's important so that we can sow the seeds evenly. It's not all up and down. It's worth spending a few minutes doing that. So I've got my packet of seed here. Onion seed is black. It's angular, you can sow it quite easily. It's not that easy to see against the compost on the camera. Doesn't matter how you sow it. Some people sow it directly out of the packet, some people put it on the palm of the hand to sow it. The important thing is that we sow evenly. Now this packet contains, usually it tells you how many in there, and I'm sure it does somewhere if I look. It's got 100 seeds. I don't want 100 seeds in here. I don't want more than about 50 in this size of seed tray. So I'm probably going to sow about half, although they're only going to be like little pieces of grass. And I'm just going to very carefully sow these thinly over the surface. In fact, I'm probably going to sow them all, because in a full size tray you'd normally put a couple of hundred in. So in this is almost a half size tray, so we can see there. Now I don't know whether the camera's picking those up, but I can just see them on the surface. I don't want them to be in clumps. I want them to be as even as possible, so that we're utilising all the compost, but they're not going to be overcrowded. And a little tip, and I know it might sound silly, but they're quite difficult to see on there, but if I hold those up and look across the surface there, and sometimes if you squint, I know you look a bit silly doing it, but just squint a little bit, you can see, and I can see that I haven't got many in this area here, but that's not too bad actually. So what I'm going to do is just knock one or two more on there. So I'm not actually going to sow them all. I don't need 100 onions anyway, and I suspect there's probably a few more than 100 seeds in this. It looks a generous amount. So I think that I'm about even there. It gives them room to grow when they've germinated, because that's the worst thing that can happen, is that you sow them so thickly that when they germinate they just crowd each other out. So I can now put the rest of the seed in there, and if they're kept cool, onion seed will usually keep from one year to the next, so keep them cool and sealed, or I might sow some more later. Now as a general rule, seeds need thin covering with a very thin layer of compost. We've got to just make them disappear from sight. Now you could do it by hand, and if we imagine this is the surface there, we could just very thinly sprinkle some compost over like that. But you can see, even though I've done that thinly, it's thicker in places than others. So we want to give them an even covering so that they all come through at the same time. So ideally a little seed sieve is ideal, and you can buy them. This is one I've had for years. It's just a purpose-made one with a gauze in there, and I've got one that I actually made years and years ago when I was a student, just out of a bit of board in there, and this is the sort of gauze that people used to put over their pantry windows. And what we're going to do with this is to put a bit of compost in, and it's worth practicing first. A little bit of compost in, and if I just move those out the way, you'll see what I mean. We can get it nice and even. So I'm just going to then tap it, and it goes through nice and evenly like that. And that's how we should be covering our seeds, so that when I push my finger through, you can see it's an even depth all the way. So if you haven't got a little seed sieve, it's well worth buying one, because you'll use it many times in the future. So just gently tapping away, and we're going to cover them until the seeds disappear basically. Then that means we've covered them in about their own depth of compost. So just gently tap away like that, not too thick, nice and even. Just brush this compost away. It's all about keeping it neat and tidy and even. And the last thing of course is we want to put a label in, and then I'm going to get the watering can, give those a quick drink, and then they can go into the propagator, and that can go onto the windowsill, and then we'll just keep an eye on them. They take about 2 weeks to germinate. They don't need to be too warm at all. They need about anything between 12 to 14 degrees centigrade, which that is perfect. If you've got one with a thermostat, all the better, but I think that little gentle base heat will be just enough so that they germinate slowly, and then when they do germinate and we've got little seedlings, just like little pieces of grass initially pushing through, I can then on warm days take the perspex cover off just so they get plenty of air around them, and we'll get strong seedlings. And when they're big enough to prick out and move on to the next stage, we'll come back to them and I'll show you what to do within them. So a little bit of heat, there's all sorts you can be sowing, not only onions, you can do early tomatoes, aubergines and peppers on a bright windowsill. So get sowing. So there you go, all sown, watered in the propagator. All I've got to do now is pop them on the windowsill and plug it in. Next week, we'll be back doing more sowing with sweet peas. So we'll see you then. Bye.